There is a 40-second scene in The Dark Knight where Batman stands behind a wall of screens showing every person in Gotham in real time, listening to every phone call, watching every movement, tracking every soul in the city without a single one of them knowing. Lucius Fox looks at it and says 3 words: beautiful, unethical, dangerous, in that order. The film came out in 2008. 1 year later, a program called PRISM was quietly running inside the NSA, doing to every American citizen exactly what Batman did to every person in Gotham. Nobody voted for it. Nobody consented to it. Most people did not find out it existed for another 5 years. The Dark Knight is a warning dressed as a superhero movie. A warning about what order actually costs, who actually pays for it, and what happens to the people who build it when they decide the emergency is real enough to justify anything. Section 1. The plan that wasn't a plan. There is a scene early in The Dark Knight where the Joker sits across from Gotham's mob bosses in a basement. He has crashed their meeting wearing a purple suit and grease paint. One of the mob bosses, a man named Gamble, puts a price on his head immediately. $500,000. Dead. The Joker does not flinch. He leans back and tells them he is not a schemer. He says schemers try to control their little corners of the world. He says he is different. A dog chasing cars. He would not know what to do with one if he caught it. Most people hear this and conclude the Joker is chaos made human. Random. Purposeless. A force of nature with no goal beyond destruction. That reading is completely wrong. The Joker robs a bank in the opening sequence with military coordination. He takes over the mob's money supply. He assassinates a police commissioner. He blows up a hospital. He rigs 2 ferries with enough precision that both boats are wired before anyone notices. He stays ahead of Batman, the police, and the mob simultaneously for the entire film. None of that is random. A dog chasing cars does not do any of that. What the Joker means when he says he has no plan is something more specific and more dangerous. He means he has no outcome he is terrified of losing. No corner of the world he is guarding. And that is what makes him more dangerous than anyone else in the film. Every other character, Batman, Gordon, Dent, the mob bosses, has something they are protecting. The Joker understands that the thing you are protecting is the handle he needs to pull you apart. That is the real opening argument of The Dark Knight. Not chaos versus order in the abstract. Something sharper. What happens when a system built entirely around protecting things meets a force with nothing to lose? The film's answer is not comfortable. Christopher Nolan began writing The Dark Knight in 2005. The film came out in July 2008. Between those 2 years, the United States government had built a secret mass surveillance program, was fighting a war using methods that violated international law, and was holding hundreds of people in a prison in Cuba without charging them with anything. The people responsible said all of it was necessary, that the threat was too large for normal rules to apply. Nolan has said he did not set out to make a political film. He said he was drawn to Batman because the character raised interesting questions about justice and identity. That is probably true. It does not matter at all. Because what the film became, what it means when watched now, is one of the most precise accounts of how a society convinces itself that emergency measures are temporary when they almost never are. Gotham at the start of the film is not a broken city. Batman, Gordon, and Harvey Dent have spent months dismantling organized crime through coordinated legal and extra-legal pressure. The city has started to believe in itself again. Dent is the symbol of that belief. A district attorney winning in open court within the law, making the vigilante in the mask potentially unnecessary. The Joker walks into this recovering city and does not attack its weakest point. He attacks its strongest. He targets Dent specifically, the symbol of legitimate order rather than the shadow figure outside it. Because the Joker understands that breaking the symbol of order is worth more than breaking any individual piece of the system. When Dent becomes Two-Face, when Gotham's district attorney starts flipping a coin to decide who lives, the Joker has done something no amount of robbery or murder could accomplish. He has turned the city's hope into its nightmare. Not by attacking from outside, by finding the pressure point inside the best person Gotham had. This is where most analysis of the film stops. It focuses on the Joker's performance, on the surveillance machine, on the ferry. The section that actually contains the film's deepest argument is Harvey Dent's destruction and the choice Gordon and Batman make afterward. The lie they tell. The 8 years that follow. Batman and Gordon stand over Dent's body and choose to hide what he did. They decide that Gotham needs to believe in something, even if that something is not real. Batman takes the blame for Dent's murders. Gordon tells the lie in public. The city mourns a hero who died as a killer and passes a law in that hero's name that keeps hundreds of criminals behind bars. The lie works. For 8 years, it works completely. That ending is not a victory. It is a demonstration. The Joker lost every tactical battle and won the only one that mattered. He proved that the people who believe in order, who build it, protect it, dedicate their lives to it, will eventually do something to preserve it that order itself would never permit. Batman crosses lines to stop the Joker. Gordon tells a lie to save the city. Both of them become, in their final choices, exactly what the Joker told Harvey Dent they always were. Schemers. People making decisions in the dark on behalf of everyone else. The film is not a story about a hero stopping a villain. It is a story about what a city does to itself when it decides the threat is bad enough to justify anything. And it is a story about what happens 8 years later, when the thing the piece was built on finally meets the light. There is a reason this film keeps finding new audiences. Not because it is a superhero movie, though it is. Because the pattern it identifies keeps repeating. In legislation nobody had time to read, in prisons that operated outside the law, in surveillance systems that ran for years before anyone outside them knew they existed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves from the film's argument to the science underneath it. Specifically, what happens to perfectly ordinary people when the system around them removes the normal rules and hands them power over others. Section 2. Good people, bad barrels. In August of 1971, 24 college students walked into the basement of the psychology building at Stanford University. Every one of them had been screened beforehand by psychologists, checking for mental illness, emotional problems, anything unusual. All 24 passed. They were, by every available measure, completely normal, healthy young men. Then a coin was flipped. 12 became guards, 12 became prisoners. The assignment was random. The guards received uniforms, wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses. The prisoners received numbers instead of names. Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist running the study, expected it to last 2 weeks. He shut it down after 6 days. Within days, the guards had begun doing things nobody told them to do. Waking prisoners in the middle of the night for no reason. Making them clean toilets with bare hands. Taking away blankets. putting prisoners in a small closet they called the hole, playing prisoners against each other with small privileges. They had not been trained for any of this. No authority figure told them it was acceptable. They invented it and then escalated it, because the structure around them, the uniforms, the batons, the role of guard, told them this was what guards do. 5 prisoners had emotional breakdowns severe enough to be removed early. 1 developed a full body rash. Young men who had walked into the basement as confident and healthy became passive, depressed, and unable to function within days. Zimbardo himself was not immune. He had assigned himself the role of prison superintendent and began making decisions as the superintendent rather than as the scientist. His girlfriend, a psychologist named Christina Maslach, visited on day 5, looked at what was happening, and told him he should be ashamed of himself. He ended the experiment the next morning. The conclusion Zimbardo drew was not that some people are secretly cruel. The conclusion was that the situation shapes the behavior. The guards were not bullies before they put on the uniform. The prisoners were not weak people before they were given numbers. The role produced the behavior. The structure shaped the person. He called this the difference between bad apples and bad barrels. The common explanation for atrocities, soldiers committing war crimes, guards torturing inmates, is that those individuals were bad apples, broken people, exceptions. Remove the individual, and the system is clean. Zimbardo's evidence said the barrel is usually the problem. Put good apples in a bad barrel, and they rot. The institution shapes the person. And once that is understood, the question of how atrocities happen stops being about individual monsters and starts being about what the structure around ordinary people is telling them they are allowed to do. In 1961, a decade before Stanford, Stanley Milgram ran a different experiment at Yale. He wanted to understand how ordinary people had participated in the Holocaust. He recruited regular Americans through newspaper ads and brought them into a lab, one at a time. The setup told them they were helping study learning and memory. They would act as the teacher. Another person, actually an actor, would be the learner. When the learner got a question wrong, the teacher was supposed to deliver an electric shock. Each wrong answer meant a higher voltage. The shocks were not real. The learner was an actor. The teachers did not know this. As the voltages climbed and the actor in the other room made sounds of pain, then demanded to be released, then went completely silent. The authority figure in a lab coat said 4 things when teachers hesitated. Please continue. The experiment requires it. It is absolutely essential. You have no other choice. 65% of participants pressed the button all the way to the maximum voltage. Not because they wanted to. They showed visible distress. Some trembled. Some cried. They pressed the button anyway because the structure around them, the lab coat, the university setting, the language of scientific necessity, told them that continuing was what was expected. Milgram's conclusion was precise. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs without any particular cruelty in them, can become part of a destructive process. When the structure says continue, most people continue, even when everything in them is saying stop. Both experiments arrive at the same place. The behavior comes from the system, not the person. Change the system, and the behavior changes. Keep the structure intact, and the numbers stay consistent across countries, decades, and cultures. In 2003, soldiers from the 372nd Military Police Company were stationed at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. They were not selected because they were unusually cruel. They had no documented history of violence. They were soldiers doing a job. The Army's own investigation concluded that between October and December of 2003, numerous incidents of sadistic and criminal abuses were carried out against detainees. The same investigation found that military intelligence personnel had instructed the military police to set the conditions for detainee interrogations. The system had authorized it. The chain of command had created the environment. 11 soldiers were eventually charged. The commanding officers who built the conditions largely kept their careers. Human Rights Watch stated clearly that the pattern of abuse did not result from individual soldiers breaking the rules. The rules themselves, or the absence of clear rules, had produced the behavior. The barrel had been shaped by people above the apples. The apples rotted on schedule. The film understands this. Gotham's corrupt cops are not presented as villains. They are tired people inside a broken institution, making the compromises the institution normalized around them. The Joker does not need to find cruel people. He needs to find the right structure and apply the right pressure. The cruelty follows on its own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves from the science to the specific legislation. From the psychology of how ordinary people participate in systems they would not individually choose, to the specific moment in October 2001 when a structure was built that would shape the behavior of institutions and agencies for the next 2 decades. Section 3. The emergency that never ended. On the morning of October 26, 2001, President George W. Bush signed a piece of legislation into law that was 131 pages long. It had been introduced to Congress 3 days earlier. Many of the people who voted for it said afterward that they had not had time to read it. The vote in the Senate was 98-1. The vote in the House was 357-66. The single senator who voted against it, Russ Feingold of Wisconsin, felt the need to explain himself on the Senate floor. He said that the first duty of a democracy is to defend itself. And then he said that the second duty is to make sure that in defending itself, it does not become the thing it is defending against. Nobody much listened to Feingold that day. The attacks of September 11th had happened 45 days earlier. The country was still raw. The Bush administration had made clear that members of Congress who voted against the bill would be held responsible for whatever came next. That pressure, unstated but real, hanging over the chamber like smoke, was enough. The bill was called the USA Patriot Act. That name was not an accident. It was an acronym constructed after the fact to produce the word patriot, because no senator wanted to vote against something called the Patriot Act 6 weeks after September 11th. The acronym was the point. The name was a dare. What the Patriot Act actually did was rewrite the rules about who the government could spy on and how. Before the act, law enforcement agencies generally needed to go to a court and show a specific reason to tap a phone, read emails, or search property. The standard was called probable cause. It existed because the founders of the country had been ruled by a government that searched homes and seized papers without justification, and they had decided that a free country needed a wall between its citizens and that kind of power. The Patriot Act lowered that wall considerably. Under Section 215, the government could demand records from businesses, phone companies, libraries, banks, internet providers, without needing to show probable cause. They needed only to certify that the records were relevant to a terrorism investigation. The businesses that received these demands were forbidden from telling anyone. A library could be forced to hand over the reading records of its patrons and could not legally tell those patrons that their records had been taken. Under Section 213, the government could search a person's home without notifying them. The previous requirement that law enforcement tell people when their property was searched was replaced with a standard that said notice had to be given in a reasonable period, which could be extended indefinitely. The FBI was given authority to issue national security letters, demands for records from companies that required no court approval at all. By 2004, the FBI was issuing 56,507 of these letters per year. All of this was presented as temporary. The people who passed the act were not, in most cases, trying to build a permanent surveillance state. They were scared, responding to pressure, and believed that once the emergency passed, the emergency tools would be put away. This is the exact logic Batman uses when he builds the sonar surveillance system in The Dark Knight. The threat is real. The tool works. The person using it intends to destroy it when the crisis is over. The difference between the film and the Patriot Act is that in the film, Lucius Fox is standing right there with his hand on the off switch and a resignation letter in his pocket. In reality, there was no Lucius Fox. There was no one with both the access and the moral clarity to stand in front of the system and say, "This ends now." And so, it did not end. The Patriot Act was renewed in 2006, then again in 2011. When some provisions were allowed to expire in 2015, they were replaced almost immediately by a new law called the USA Freedom Act, which preserved most of the same powers in slightly modified form. The emergency tools became the permanent architecture. Meanwhile, inside the agencies the Patriot Act had empowered, something larger was being built. The program that Edward Snowden revealed in 2013, called PRISM, had begun in 2007. It gave the NSA the ability to access data stored on the servers of the largest technology companies in the world: Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Apple, Skype, YouTube. The companies had been required to comply by court orders. Yahoo sued the NSA in a secret court and lost. After losing, they were required to participate and forbidden from telling their users. By March of 2013, the NSA had collected 97 billion pieces of data from global computer networks. The agency's stated goal, according to internal documents, was to collect everything. Every call, every message, every search, every connection. The database was described by a source inside the agency as the largest ever assembled in the world. Snowden was 29 years old when he made his decision. The moment that pushed him over was not a classified document. It was a public hearing. On March 12, 2013, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, appeared before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Senator Ron Wyden asked him directly whether the NSA collected any type of data on millions of Americans. Clapper said no. Snowden watched this and understood what he was seeing. The head of the country's intelligence apparatus had lied, under oath, to the elected representatives whose job was to provide oversight of that apparatus. 3 days later, Snowden quit his job. In May of 2013, he flew to Hong Kong. In June, he handed documents to journalists from The Guardian and The Washington Post. The Pentagon later described it as the biggest theft of United States secrets in the country's history. The documents revealed that the NSA was collecting the phone records of millions of ordinary Verizon customers every single day. Through a court order, the company was forbidden to disclose. It was tracking cell phone locations, intercepting emails, storing financial data, and monitoring the communications of allied world leaders, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The Guardian and The Washington Post won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for publishing the Snowden documents. The Dark Knight came out in July 2008. The NSA's PRISM program had been running for 1 year at that point. The cell phone surveillance system Batman builds, converting every phone in Gotham into a tracking device without anyone's knowledge, was already operational in real life. The film presented it as a moral crisis requiring immediate dismantling. Reality had normalized it so thoroughly that it took 5 more years and a whistleblower willing to destroy his own life before the public found out it existed. The Oversight Court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, met in secret, heard only from the government, and approved nearly every request it received. Between 1979 and 2012, the court approved 900 government surveillance requests. It denied 11. The system, supposed to check government power, had become a rubber stamp that made the power look like it had been checked. The surveillance tools built for counterterrorism had migrated to other purposes. The FBI's national security letters, originally designed for foreign intelligence investigations involving suspected spies, were being used by 2005 to demand the records of ordinary Las Vegas businesses, casinos, storage warehouses, car rental agencies. A federal court later ruled that the NSL provisions of the Patriot Act were unconstitutional. Nobody had decided one day to turn a counterterrorism tool into a general-purpose surveillance engine. It happened gradually, extension by extension, in the same way that the Stanford guards escalated their behavior without ever making a single dramatic decision to become cruel. The barrel shape changed. The apples rotated inside it. The behavior followed. By the time Snowden's documents were published, the program had grown into something that its own oversight body had ruled partially unconstitutional in 2011, in a secret ruling the public was not allowed to see. The collection had continued because the ruling was classified, and nobody outside the system knew to demand that it stop. An appeals court finally ruled in 2015 that the mass collection of phone records had been unlawful. The program had been running, unlawfully, for years, with the knowledge of the agencies running it and the complete ignorance of the public it was being used on. The emergency never ended. The measures built for it became the permanent structure of governance. The people inside that structure were not villains. They were analysts and agents doing their jobs, following the roles they had been given. Inside a barrel shaped by decisions made in the 45 days after the worst attack on American soil in modern history. Batman's surveillance machine had a self-destruct. The Patriot Act did not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the surveillance machine is only one piece of the picture the film is assembling. Because while Batman was building his sonar system, another character was being built in parallel. A character whose fall from good to terrible has nothing to do with surveillance or legal authority. Harvey Dent's destruction is personal, and the way the system chose to respond to that destruction, the lie it told to keep order intact, is where the film's darkest argument lives. Section 4. The White Knight and the Necessary Lie. Harvey Dent has one of the best introductions of any character in The Dark Knight. He walks into a courtroom, faces down a mobster, gets a gun pulled on him at point-blank range, and disarms the man with one hand while keeping his other hand in his pocket. He does not flinch. He does not escalate. He just takes the gun away and goes back to making his case. The whole sequence lasts maybe 40 seconds, and it tells the audience everything they need to know about who Harvey Dent is at the start of the film. He is not afraid. He is not performing courage for the cameras. He is simply a man who has decided what he believes in and has organized his entire life around it. And fear does not fit into that organization anywhere useful, so he has largely set it aside. Aaron Eckhart, the actor who played Dent, said in interviews after the film came out that Dent was a truth teller at his core. That despite whatever pressure or coercion or corruption was around him, Harvey Dent was going to stay true to the moral center and the truth. That people could rely on that. That you do not want to lose your Harvey Dents in life. The film agrees with this assessment completely. And then it spends 2.5 hours destroying him. To understand what the film is doing with Harvey Dent, it helps to understand what he represents in the structure of Gotham at the start of the story. Gotham has 3 people trying to clean it up. Batman operates from the shadows, outside the law, using methods that the law does not permit. Commissioner Gordon operates inside the law, but is surrounded by corruption so thick that he cannot trust most of the people who work for him. Both of them are compromised. One by the fact that he is a vigilante, one by the fact that the institution he serves is rotten around him. Dent is different. Dent operates inside the system, and the system is actually working for him. He has taken on the mob through legitimate legal channels, and he is winning. He has locked up criminals using evidence gathered properly, through courts that are functioning, by an office that the public trusts. He is, as the film explicitly calls him, Gotham's White Knight. The legitimate version of what Batman is trying to do. The proof that the system, if it has someone good enough inside it, can actually deliver justice without anyone having to put on a mask. Batman sees this. He says early in the film that Harvey Dent is the hero Gotham deserves, the public face of a war on crime that Batman has been fighting from the darkness. The plan is that Dent becomes the symbol, earns the city's trust, and makes Batman unnecessary. The vigilante can retire because the institution has produced someone good enough to make vigilantism obsolete. This is the plan the Joker destroys, and he destroys it not by attacking the institution, but by attacking the person. The Joker's method with Dent is precise, and it is cruel, and it is worth understanding in detail, because it maps almost exactly onto something real about how systems of order break down. He does not argue with Dent. He does not try to convince him that justice is an illusion or that the law is corrupt. He does not present a philosophical case for chaos. He finds the one person whose existence makes Dent's belief in the system feel personal rather than abstract. Rachel Dawes, the woman Dent loves, and he uses her as a pressure point. He puts Dent and Rachel in 2 different locations. He tells Batman where they are. He sets it up so that Batman can only reach one of them in time. Rachel dies. Dent survives, but the left side of his face is burned completely away in the explosion, and he wakes up in a hospital to find that the person he organized his life around is gone, and his own face has been split in half. One side clean, one side destroyed, as if the universe itself has illustrated his new condition. The Joker visits Dent in the hospital. This scene is one of the most important in the film, and it is easy to watch it and focus on how extraordinary Heath Ledger is in it, because he is extraordinary. But the content of what the Joker says to Dent in that scene is the film's thesis statement about order and how it breaks. He tells Dent that the schemers are the problem, that the people with plans, the cops, the politicians, the district attorneys, are the ones who put Dent where he is. That he himself just does what he does without a plan, without an agenda, and that this makes him honest in a way that the schemers never are. He tells Dent that madness is like gravity. All it takes is a little push. Then he hands Dent a gun and walks away. The Joker is not trying to recruit Dent to chaos. He is trying to show Dent that the system Dent believed in was always an illusion. That the order Dent fought for was maintained by people who made choices, who decided whose suffering was acceptable and whose was not, and called those choices justice. That the only honest system is a coin flip. Equal chance, no favoritism, no planning. Pure randomness applied equally to everyone. Dent takes the gun, and he starts making his list. What happens to Harvey Dent after the hospital is one of the most psychologically accurate portrayals of how a good person becomes capable of terrible things that any superhero film has ever produced. Dent does not become evil. This is the important thing to register. He does not decide that hurting people is acceptable. He decides that the framework he used to determine what was acceptable, the law, the courts, due process, the careful gathering of evidence, was a fiction. That behind the framework, all along, were just people making choices. And if all choices are equally arbitrary, then his coin is as legitimate a decision-making tool as a jury. He targets the specific people he holds responsible. The corrupt cops who were working for the mob boss who gave the order, Commissioner Gordon, because Gordon had a corrupt officer on his detail who knew where Rachel was. He is not random. He is, in his own mind, delivering a kind of accounting, making the people who made choices feel the weight of chance, the way Rachel felt the weight of their choices. Two-Face believes he is being more honest than the system he replaced. The system pretended to be fair. The coin actually is fair. This is the Joker's logic, adopted wholesale by the man who was supposed to be the Joker's opposite. The film is making a specific argument here. It is saying that a person's belief in order is only as strong as the personal stakes that make order feel worth believing in. Take away those stakes, destroy the thing a person loves, remove the reason the system feels protective rather than abstract, and the belief does not survive the loss. Dent believed in the law because the law felt like it was protecting something real. When the thing it was supposed to protect was destroyed by people operating inside the system, corrupt cops, compromised procedures, the chaos the Joker had engineered through legitimate channels, the belief went with it. This pattern, the good person destroyed not by being argued out of their values, but by having the ground those values stood on removed, has a real-world shape that is worth examining carefully. After the September 11th attacks, the United States government did not just change its surveillance laws. It changed through a series of legal memos written in secret by officials at the Department of Justice, the rules about what could be done to prisoners in American custody. The memos, written primarily by a lawyer named John Yoo and approved by the head of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, Jay Bybee, argued that the president had the authority to authorize interrogation techniques that previous administrations had considered torture. The memos redefined torture so narrowly that almost nothing qualified. They argued that international laws like the Geneva Conventions, which set minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners of war, did not apply to people the government classified as enemy combatants. They said that the president, during wartime, had essentially unlimited authority to authorize whatever methods were deemed necessary. These were not public documents. They were classified. The people writing them were lawyers doing their jobs inside a legal framework that had been built for a specific emergency. The result of their work was a set of permissions that made Abu Ghraib possible, and that made Guantanamo Bay's indefinite detention without trial legally defensible. At least within the closed system of secret memos and secret courts, that had been created to evaluate such things. The lawyers were Harvey Dent's. They had gone into law because they believed in it. They had built careers around the system. And when the system, in the form of an administration responding to a genuine emergency with genuine fear, asked them to find a legal justification for crossing lines that the law had previously treated as uncrossable, most of them found the justification. Because the structure around them had changed. Because the barrel had been reshaped. Because the emergency had made the coin flip feel more honest than the rules. Guantanamo Bay opened in January of 2002. The first detainees arrived on January 11th, shackled and hooded, transported from Afghanistan and the days after the American invasion. By the time the facility reached its peak population, 780 people from 48 different countries had been held there. Of those 780 people, 7 were eventually convicted of anything. 7 out of 780. 5 of those 7 convictions came through plea agreements, arrangements where the person pleaded guilty in exchange for the possibility of being released. The remaining 773 people were held without being convicted of any crime. Most were held without ever being charged with any crime. Some were held for more than 20 years. The legal basis for holding people without charge or trial was a document called the Authorization for Use of Military Force, passed by Congress 3 days after the September 11th attacks. It authorized the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against those responsible for the attacks. From this document, and from the secret legal memos written by you and Bybee and others, the Bush administration derived the authority to create a detention system that operated outside the reach of American courts, outside the reach of the Geneva Conventions, and outside the reach of any oversight mechanism that the public was allowed to see. A senior Bush administration official named Susan Crawford, who had been appointed to oversee the military trials at Guantanamo, became in 2009 the first person from that administration to publicly state that torture had occurred there. She said specifically that the treatment of a detainee named Mohammed al-Qahtani had met the legal definition of torture. She said the decision not to prosecute him was because of how he had been treated. The system that was built to deliver justice, the military commissions, the detention facility, the legal framework, had tortured the people it was supposed to be putting on trial. And that torture had made it impossible to try them. The order that the system was designed to produce had been undermined by the methods the system had chosen to use to produce it. This is Harvey Dent with the coin, at national scale. The comparison to Dent is not rhetorical. The people who built and operated these systems were not, in most cases, people who wanted to torture anyone. They were lawyers and military officers and government officials who had been placed inside a structure that told them the emergency justified the method. That the threat was real enough, and it was real, to suspend the rules that normally governed what a government could do to a person in its custody. They had been handed a coin. They had been told that the old rules, probable cause, due process, the presumption of innocence, the prohibition against cruel treatment, were a kind of luxury that a pre-September 11th world could afford and a post-September 11th world could not. That what looked like justice in peacetime looked like naivety when the stakes were this high. Dent tells himself something similar when he starts going after the corrupt cops and the mob boss. The normal rules, evidence, trial, the presumption of innocence, are what the people who killed Rachel used against him, used against her. The normal rules are what the Joker moved through like water. If the rules are the problem, then removing the rules is the solution. The coin is fairer than the courts. Randomness is more honest than a system that can be gamed. The Department of Justice's secret memos made essentially the same argument. Normal rules about what you can do to a prisoner were written for a normal world. This was not a normal world. The rules had to change because the threat had changed. The film does not let Batman off the hook for his role in this. Batman, trying to find the Joker, takes a mob accountant named Lau back to Gotham from Hong Kong without going through any legal extradition process. He simply flies there, breaks into a building, and brings the man back in a duffel bag. This is, by any legal standard, kidnapping. Batman knows this. He does it anyway because the stakes are high enough. In the interrogation scene, the scene where Batman has the Joker in a room in the police station, he does not ask questions politely. He beats the Joker. He throws him against walls. He stands on the Joker's hands. This is torture. The film does not use that word, and the scene is filmed in a way that makes it feel like righteous fury rather than systematic cruelty. But it is the same act, performed with the same justification, that the secret memos were written to permit. The Joker, characteristically, finds this funny. He tells Batman that there is nothing to threaten him with, that Batman has nothing. And then he tells Batman where both Rachel and Dent are, knowing that Batman can only save one of them, having designed the situation so that the act of trying to save someone will guarantee that the other one is lost. Batman's torture accomplishes nothing useful. The information the Joker gives him is a trap. The method that the emergency justified produced no result except confirming that the Joker could not be broken by it, and that he had planned for exactly this response. The film is precise about this. The torture does not work. The kidnapping does not work in the way it was supposed to. The emergency measures, taken by a person with genuinely good intentions in response to a genuinely monstrous threat, do not produce the outcome they were meant to produce. They produce Harvey Dent in a hospital room, listening to a man in a purple suit tell him that schemers put him where he is. Then comes the ending, the part of the film that slides past so quickly that it is easy to miss the weight of what is actually happening. Dent is dead. He died going after Gordon's son, in a fall that Batman caused while trying to stop him. Batman and Gordon are standing over the body, and they have a decision to make. Dent killed 5 people in his rampage as Two-Face. If those killings become public, the legal work Dent did, the criminals he put away, the cases he built, becomes unstable. Defense lawyers will argue that everything Dent touched was compromised. The criminals he locked up will walk. The progress the city has made will collapse. So Gordon and Batman choose to lie. They agree to tell Gotham that Batman killed those 5 people, that Dent died a hero, that the White Knight went out clean. The lie works. In the film, it holds for 8 years. Gotham passes something called the Dent Act, legislation built on Dent's heroic reputation that keeps hundreds of criminals locked up without parole. The peace the city enjoys in The Dark Knight Rises is built entirely on the false foundation of Harvey Dent's manufactured heroic death. This is Plato's noble lie. The idea, ancient, used by governments and institutions throughout history, that some truths are too damaging to tell, that the stability of the system requires the public to believe something that is not true, that the people in charge of the truth are also in charge of deciding which parts of it the public can handle. Gordon tells the lie with a broken face. Batman runs into the dark. The city cheers. Philosopher Slavoj Žižek, writing about The Dark Knight and comparing it directly to the WikiLeaks scandal of 2010, said that the film's ending is the signal political moment in 21st century cinema. He argued that Batman and Gordon's choice, to protect the system's stability by hiding the truth about the system's best symbol, is exactly what governments do when the truth about how order is maintained becomes too costly to acknowledge. The Dent Act is built on a dead man's false reputation. The peace it produces is real. The foundation it sits on is fiction. And the film knows, with the quiet certainty of a story that has been watching this pattern very carefully, that fiction is not a stable material to build on. Something always comes along to strike a match. What makes the noble lie so dangerous, in Gotham and in the real world both, is not that it fails immediately. The most dangerous version of the noble lie is the one that works for a while. The one that produces genuine stability, genuine progress, genuine peace. Long enough that the people living inside it start to believe that the foundation is solid, that the emergency really did produce a lasting order, that the lie was worth it and the cost was acceptable. The cost always comes due. The question the film leaves open, and the question that the next chapter of this story takes up, is who pays it? Because in Gotham, as in real governments and real institutions, the bill for the noble lie is almost never sent to the people who chose to tell it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That pattern, powerful people choosing deception, ordinary people bearing the cost, goes much further than one film and one city. The next section is about what happens when private companies, rather than governments, get access to the same kind of tools. When the surveillance machine is not run by Batman, but by a political data firm. When the people whose phones are being turned into tracking devices did not even know there was a Joker to stop. Section 5. The sonar machine nobody voted for. In 2013, a researcher at Cambridge University named Alexander Kogan built a personality quiz. He put it on Facebook. He called it, "This is Your Digital Life." He paid people small amounts of money, $1 or $2 each, to take the quiz through a website called Amazon Mechanical Turk, a platform where people complete small online tasks for small payments. Around 270,000 people took the quiz. The quiz asked about personality. It was framed as a psychological study. The people who took it consented to give Kogan access to their Facebook profiles. That part was disclosed. What was not disclosed, what most of the people who took the quiz had no way of knowing, was that by agreeing to give Kogan access to their own profiles, they were also giving him access to the profiles of everyone on their friends list. Every photo, every like, every piece of location data, every interest, political affiliation, relationship status, and religious view that their friends had ever posted on the platform. 270,000 people took the quiz. Their friends lists collectively contained the profiles of approximately 87 million people. None of those 87 million people had agreed to anything. None of them knew their data was being collected. Most of them never found out until 5 years later, when a whistleblower went to the press and the story broke across the front pages of newspapers on 2 continents simultaneously. Kogan gave the data to a political consulting firm called Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica used it to build psychological profiles of American voters. They classified those voters using a system based on 5 personality traits: how open they were to new ideas, how conscientious, how extroverted, how agreeable, how prone to anxiety and emotional instability. Then they used those profiles to design political advertisements targeted specifically at the psychological weaknesses of individual people. Not groups, not demographics, individual people, by name, identified through the data their friends had unknowingly given away. Cambridge Analytica worked for Ted Cruz's presidential campaign in 2015. When Cruz did not win the Republican nomination, they moved to the Trump campaign. Their first payment from the Trump organization came in July of 2016. They also had ties to the Leave.eu campaign in the United Kingdom, the organization that campaigned for Britain to leave the European Union in the 2016 Brexit referendum. A former Cambridge Analytica employee named Christopher Wylie eventually became the whistleblower who broke the story open. He said, in plain language, what the company had been doing. His description of it was direct. They exploited Facebook to harvest millions of people's profiles, built models to exploit what they knew about those people, and targeted their inner demons. Inner demons. The phrase is worth sitting with for a moment. Not their interests, not their political beliefs, their inner demons. The anxieties, the fears, the insecurities, the places where a person is most likely to respond to a message not because the message is true, but because it lands on something raw. This is the sonar system from The Dark Knight, rebuilt without Batman's self-destruct function and handed to a political consulting firm with paying clients. The film's surveillance machine works by converting every cell phone in Gotham into a listening and tracking device. Batman uses it to locate one specific person, the Joker, in a city of millions. Lucius Fox objects because the system has access to everyone, not just the target. The fact that Batman's intentions are good does not change the nature of the tool. The tool, Lucius says, is too much power for one person to have. It does not matter that the person holding it is trustworthy. Power that large, held without consent, is dangerous by its nature. Cambridge Analytica's system worked differently in its mechanics, but identically in its moral structure. It had access to the private data of 87 million people who had not consented to being in the system. It used that data to identify psychological vulnerabilities. It then delivered messages designed to exploit those vulnerabilities, not to inform people or persuade them with evidence, but to find the place in each person's mind where fear or anger or resentment lived and push on it. There was no Lucius Fox. There was no self-destruct. There was no one inside the operation with both the access and the moral clarity to look at what was being built and say, "This is too much power for any organization to have over this many people without their knowledge." There was Christopher Wylie, eventually. But Wylie came forward years after the tool had already been used. The damage was done before the warning. Facebook had known about the data problem since 2015. That year, The Guardian had published a story reporting that Cambridge Analytica was helping Ted Cruz's campaign using psychological data based on research spanning tens of millions of Facebook users. Facebook saw the story. Facebook contacted Kogan and Cambridge Analytica. Both certified in writing that they had deleted the data. Facebook accepted those certifications and moved on. The data had not been deleted. This detail is important because it is not a technological failure. It is not a case of a system being hacked or broken into. The data was collected through Facebook's own tools, shared in the way Facebook's own platform was designed to allow sharing, and the confirmation that it had been destroyed was taken at face value by a company that had every technical means to verify the claim and chose not to. The Guardian, the New York Times, and Channel 4 News in the United Kingdom worked together for months with Wylie to prepare the story. On March 17, 2018, The Guardian and the New York Times published their articles simultaneously. Within days, more than $100 billion had been erased from Facebook's market value, as investors responded to the scale of what had been disclosed. Politicians in the United States and the United Kingdom called for Facebook's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, to testify before their legislatures. He agreed, and appeared before the United States Congress in April of 2018. The Federal Trade Commission investigated and fined Facebook $5 billion for its privacy violations. $5 billion was, at that moment, the largest fine the FTC had ever levied. It was also roughly 1 month of Facebook's revenue at the time. The Cambridge Analytica scandal is the Dark Knight's surveillance argument stripped of its heroic framing. In the film, Batman has a reason. There is a Joker. People are dying. The clock is running. The justification for crossing the line is visible on screen, and the audience has spent 2 hours watching it kill people. The moral question the film asks: does a real enough threat justify this kind of tool? Lands inside a story that has made the threat feel as real and as urgent as possible. Cambridge Analytica had no Joker. The people whose data was harvested without consent were not in immediate danger from a terrorist. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives, many of them not particularly engaged in politics at all, whose psychological profiles were being assembled and weaponized not to save anyone, but to help political campaigns win elections. The stakes were lower. The justification was thinner. The tool was the same. And the outcome: 87 million people's private information used to target their psychological vulnerabilities without their knowledge or consent, as part of campaigns that affected the political future of 2 of the largest democracies on Earth, was in some ways more consequential than anything the Joker managed. The Joker wanted to prove that people could be pushed into choosing chaos. Cambridge Analytica was doing it quietly, invisibly, through their Facebook feeds, without anyone knowing they were being pushed at all. The psychological targeting that Cambridge Analytica was doing had a specific mechanism that is worth understanding, because it connects directly to what the Milgram experiments and the Stanford Prison experiment had already established about how people respond to pressure they cannot see. Milgram found that 65% of people would continue pressing the shock button when an authority figure in a lab coat told them to continue. The compliance rate dropped significantly when the person being shocked was in the same room, when the teacher could see the learner's face. Distance made compliance easier. Invisibility made it easier still. Cambridge Analytica's model worked on the same principle. A person who sees a political advertisement on television knows it is an advertisement. They know who paid for it. They bring a certain amount of skepticism to it. But a person who sees a piece of content in their Facebook feed, content that appears to have been shared by a friend, that speaks directly to something they have privately expressed anxiety about, that arrives without the visual markers of an official campaign advertisement, does not have the same defenses up. The distance between the tool and the person being targeted made the targeting less visible. And less visible pressure is, as Milgram showed, more effective pressure. This is what inner demons means in practice. Cambridge Analytica was not trying to change what people believed. It was trying to find the belief already there, the fear, the resentment, the insecurity, and amplify it, push on it, make it feel more urgent and more real than it had felt the day before. The content was designed not to inform, but to activate, to make the emotion run hot enough that it drove behavior. Christopher Nolan has said in interviews that he did not set out to make a political film with The Dark Knight. He said he was interested in moral questions about justice and identity. He said the film reflected his concerns about threats to civilization that people take for granted. The Cambridge Analytica scandal broke 10 years after the film came out. Nobody at Cambridge Analytica had watched The Dark Knight and decided to build Lucius Fox's nightmare. The parallel exists not because the film predicted a specific event, but because the film identified a specific logic: that powerful surveillance tools, once built, migrate toward whoever can use them for whatever purpose those users define as necessary. And that logic is real and keeps producing real events. Lucius Fox tells Batman that the problem with the sonar system is not Batman's intentions. He says he knows Batman's intentions are good. The problem is the system itself. That it exists, that it works, that whoever controls it has power over everyone inside it without those people having any say. He says no good man should have that kind of power. Cambridge Analytica was not run by good men trying to save a city. It was run by people trying to win elections and get paid for winning them. The system they built had the same architecture as Batman's: mass access to private data used without consent to find and push on the most vulnerable parts of people's minds. And none of Batman's self-imposed limits. No Lucius Fox, no self-destruct, no moral crisis in a server room. Just the tool, running, doing what it was built to do. The company filed for bankruptcy in May of 2018, 2 months after the story broke. It closed its offices and dismissed its staff. The executives who had run it largely moved on to other work. The fine that Facebook paid, $5 billion, left the company profitable and operational. Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress, answered questions for many hours, and returned to running the company. The whistleblower, Christopher Wylie, did what whistleblowers do. He gave up the career he had built, accepted the legal risk that came with going public, and told the story. His reward was the knowledge that the story had been told. The people he told it about kept their money. This is not how The Dark Knight ends. In the film, the person who destroys the system, who exercises the moral authority to say, "This ends here," is Lucius Fox, who is Morgan Freeman, who has both the technical access and the institutional standing and the personal courage to make the destruction real. He types his name into the computer, and the whole system falls. One person, one decision. Clean. Reality produced Christopher Wylie, who had none of that access and none of that standing, and had to go to journalists in 2 countries and spend a year building a case that could survive legal challenges before anyone would publish it. The story came out. The tool had already been used. The elections it was used in had already happened. There is a version of this story where Facebook had its own Lucius Fox, someone inside the company who, in 2013 or 2014 or 2015, looked at what the platform's data-sharing tools were enabling and said, "This is too much power for any organization to have over this many people, and I will resign if it is not shut down." That person either did not exist, did not have access, or was not listened to. The internal records of what Facebook knew, and when it knew it, remained, for years, the company's private information. Some of it emerged through litigation and congressional inquiries. Enough came out to establish that the knowledge existed well before the story broke. Not enough came out to establish exactly who knew what, when, and what choices they made. The Lucius Fox problem is not just a problem in superhero films. It is a structural problem in every organization that builds powerful tools. The person who has both the technical understanding to know what the tool can do and the moral authority to stop it from doing it is almost never the same person. The people with technical understanding are employees. The people with moral authority are executives. Whistleblowers are usually the former, not the latter, and they pay a price the latter rarely face. The Dark Knight presents Batman's destruction of the sonar system as the morally required conclusion of the surveillance story. The tool was necessary, it was used, and then it was destroyed, because keeping it was too dangerous, regardless of who was holding it. The film presents this as the right answer. The actual history of surveillance tools, from the Patriot Act to PRISM to Cambridge Analytica, suggests that the right answer and the answer that actually happens are not often the same thing. Tools built for emergencies get kept. Systems built for specific threats get expanded. Data collected for one purpose gets used for others. And the people with the power to stop this are rarely the people with the incentive to do so. The film's most honest moment might not be the ferry scene or the interrogation room, or even the ending with Gordon standing over Dent's body. It might be the moment where Lucius Fox walks into the server room, looks at what Batman has built, and says beautiful, unethical, dangerous. Not in that order of importance. Dangerous last. Beautiful first. Because that is the order in which these things are always encountered. The tool is beautiful before anyone asks what it is dangerous to. And by the time the danger becomes clear, the beauty has already done its work. The tools discussed so far, the Patriot Act's surveillance architecture, PRISM, Cambridge Analytica's targeting system, were all built in democratic countries that had courts and oversight bodies and free press institutions capable of eventually exposing and challenging them. They were built under pressure, normalized through emergency logic, and eventually partially constrained by legal challenges and public exposure. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next version of this story is different. The next version is a country that built the same kind of system deliberately, openly, with the full participation of its government, and then expanded it until it covered every aspect of how its citizens live. A country where there is no free press to expose it, no independent court to rule it unlawful, and no Lucius Fox with a resignation letter. A country that took Batman's sonar machine, decided the Joker was anyone who disagreed with the government, and never built a self-destruct. Section 6. When the machine has no off switch. In 2014, the Chinese government announced that it was going to build a system to promote social order and foster trust in society. The announcement did not come with photographs of soldiers or threats of punishment. It came in the form of a planning document, a government notice, dry and bureaucratic, describing a future in which citizens who behaved well would be rewarded, and citizens who behaved badly would face consequences. The document called it the Social Credit System. The name sounds like something from a dystopian novel. The reality is more complicated, and in many ways, more unsettling than the simplified version that circulates in Western media. The system is not a single number assigned to every citizen by a central computer. It is a collection of overlapping databases, local government programs, corporate scoring systems, and enforcement mechanisms that vary significantly from city to city and region to region. Some parts of it are run by the national government. Some parts are run by city governments. Some parts are run by private companies like Alibaba and Ant Financial, which operate their own scoring systems for their hundreds of millions of users. What all the parts share is the same basic architecture. Collect information about how people behave. Use that information to determine whether their behavior meets the standards the system has defined as trustworthy. Reward compliance. Restrict the lives of people who fall short. By 2022, official government data showed that more than 7.2 million individuals had been designated untrustworthy persons, subject to enforcement under various components of the system. These were not people convicted of serious crimes in open courts. These were people whose behavior, financial, social, professional, and in some cases political, had been assessed by the system and found wanting. The restrictions that fall on people designated as untrustworthy are not prison sentences. They are something more subtle and in some ways more total. A person on the blacklist cannot buy a plane ticket, cannot buy a train ticket, cannot enroll their children in certain schools, cannot take out a loan, cannot stay in certain hotels, cannot be hired for certain jobs, cannot start certain types of businesses. The system does not lock a person in a room. It locks them out of the normal functioning of modern life, piece by piece, until moving through society becomes difficult enough that compliance starts to look like the easier option. A journalist named Liu Hu found this out directly. Liu Hu had spent years reporting on government corruption in China. He had exposed officials. He had written stories that powerful people did not want written. In 2015, a court ruled that he had made false statements in his reporting, a charge he disputed, and he was placed on the blacklist. He discovered what this meant when he tried to buy a plane ticket and the transaction was rejected. When he tried to buy a train ticket, same result. When he tried to purchase property, the sale was blocked. He could not travel. He could not conduct normal financial transactions. He could not, as he described it, live a normal life. Liu Hu's case was not secret. He spoke about it publicly. He wrote about it. He became, in the Western press, one of the most cited examples of how the system works against people who challenge the government. And his case illustrates something that the system's architects understood from the beginning. You do not need to put a person in a cell to control them. You need to make the cost of disobedience high enough and the mechanics of compliance visible enough that most people choose compliance before they ever reach the point of facing consequences. This is the Dark Knight's ferry dilemma, rebuilt as permanent infrastructure. On the ferries, the Joker presents a choice with a deadline: act or face destruction. The choice is visible, immediate, and framed as an emergency. The passengers can see the detonator. They know the stakes. They make a decision in real time, under pressure, with full awareness that a decision is being demanded of them. China's social credit system presents no such visible moment of choice. There is no detonator and no deadline. There is only the slow accumulation of a score, the gradual awareness that certain behaviors produce certain restrictions, and the steady pressure of a system that is always watching and always recording. The compliance it produces is not the result of a single dramatic moment of coercion. It is the result of thousands of small adjustments that people make, over time, when they understand that the system is tracking them and that the tracking has consequences. A published academic study from the University of Chicago's Journal of Politics, based on field surveys of Chinese citizens, found that public support for the social credit system is significantly higher among people who learned about it through state media than among people who were informed about its repressive potential through independent sources. The study found that when survey participants were told specifically that the system had been used to identify and repress political opponents, journalists, protesters, activists, their support dropped sharply. The system maintains support, in other words, partly by controlling the information people have about what the system does. This is the noble lie from Section 4, applied not to a single dead hero, but to the entire architecture of governance. The population supports the system because the system controls what the population knows about the system. The researchers who conducted that study drew a direct comparison to Edward Snowden. They noted that the reason Snowden's revelations about NSA surveillance had such a large impact in the United States was that they revealed something the public had not previously known. People could not consent to, or resist, or vote against a system whose existence was hidden from them. The same logic applied in China, but with a crucial difference. In China, there is no mechanism through which a Snowden could publish his documents and have them reach the public he is trying to inform. The press is state-controlled. The internet is filtered. The channels through which whistleblowers in democratic countries can reach the public do not exist in the same form. No Snowden is possible inside the system. No Guardian or Washington Post can publish the documents. No Senate hearing can demand answers from the Director of National Intelligence. The feedback loop that, in democratic countries, eventually produces at least some check on surveillance power, exposure, public pressure, legal challenge, legislative response, is closed. Not weakened, closed. This is the version of Batman's sonar machine where Lucius Fox's resignation letter has been made illegal to write. The technology behind the system is not science fiction. It is current, commercially available, and in many cases produced by the same companies whose products are used in democratic countries. Facial recognition cameras in Chinese cities operate fast enough to identify a person who is jaywalking and send a photograph of their face to a screen at the intersection before they reach the other side of the street. The image is displayed publicly, along with the person's name and a notification that they have been recorded committing an infraction. This is not a future capability being tested. It is operational in multiple Chinese cities. The system integrates data from sources that, in isolation, would seem unrelated. Financial records from banks and payment platforms, travel records from train and airline booking systems, criminal records from police databases, court records from civil and criminal proceedings, social media activity from platforms like Weibo and WeChat, professional records from employment databases. The integration of these sources is what makes the system more powerful than any individual component. A person can be financially responsible and still appear on a blacklist because of a court dispute they lost, or because of something they posted online, or because of who they are associated with. The association mechanism is particularly significant. People who are closely associated with blacklisted individuals can themselves face restrictions. Family members, business partners, friends. The system creates pressure not just on the person who has been flagged, but on everyone around that person. The people in your life become, in effect, incentivized to distance themselves from you if your score drops. The social fabric is rewoven around the system's judgments, creating isolation for those who fall short and social pressure to conform for those who have not yet fallen. The academic researchers who study the system describe what it produces in a specific way. They call it self-censorship at scale. Self-censorship is not new. People have always modified their behavior when they knew they were being watched. The Stanford Prison Experiment documented this in a controlled setting. The Milgram experiments showed that the presence of an authority figure changed what people felt they could do. The social credit system extends this principle to cover every aspect of daily life, continuously, without a specific authority figure standing in the room. People in cities where the system operates most comprehensively report that they have changed how they behave online, what they post, who they respond to, what topics they engage with. They report being more careful in financial transactions, more cautious in who they associate with publicly. Some report engaging in what the researchers describe as performative good behavior, donating blood, volunteering for government-approved events, doing visible things that they believe will register positively in the system. Not because they particularly want to do those things, but because the system is watching and the system rewards visible compliance. This is the world the Joker wanted to prove was already there. He argued that the order people display is not genuine, that it is a performance maintained by the expectation of consequences and the fear of chaos. The social credit system does not refute this argument. It operationalizes it. It takes the Joker's cynical thesis about human behavior and builds a governance structure around it. People will behave if the consequences for not behaving are clear and consistent and inescapable. The question of whether they are behaving because they believe in the values behind the behavior is irrelevant. The behavior is the point. China's system did not appear fully formed. It grew from smaller existing programs. Credit rating systems for financial behavior, blacklists for court judgments, industry-specific reputation systems for businesses. These were reasonable, limited tools. A financial credit system that tracks whether people repay loans is not inherently sinister. A court system that tracks whether businesses comply with rulings is not inherently sinister. The sinister part is the integration. When individual reasonable tools are merged into a single system that covers all behavior across all domains, the result is qualitatively different from any of the components. A financial credit score affects what loans you can get. A social credit score affects whether you can travel, whether your children can go to certain schools, whether you can be hired for certain jobs, and whether the people in your life face pressure to distance themselves from you. The expansion from one domain to all domains is the expansion from a tool to a condition of existence. This mirrors the expansion that Section 3 documented in the Patriot Act's surveillance architecture. The Act began as a counterterrorism tool. The national security letters it authorized began as a foreign intelligence mechanism. Both expanded, incrementally, into general-purpose surveillance and data collection tools used in contexts far beyond what was stated at the time of their creation. The structure expanded because structures expand. The permission migrated because permissions migrate. China's system is what happens when that migration is not slowed by courts or press or public pressure. When there is no appeals court to eventually rule parts of it unlawful. When there is no Pulitzer Prize waiting for the journalists who expose it. When the migration is not an accident or an overreach, but a design feature. By 2027, researchers and analysts who study the spread of surveillance technology predict that more than 100 countries will have adopted some form of behavioral scoring technology influenced by China's model. The spread is happening through several channels. China's Belt and Road Initiative, a massive program of infrastructure investment across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe, has included, in many cases, the installation of surveillance technology as part of the infrastructure package. Countries that accept the investment often accept the technology. The technology comes with training. The training comes with the logic embedded in the system. Countries that have adopted versions of the technology include Venezuela, Ecuador, and others. The specific implementations vary. The underlying architecture, collect behavior data, score it, use the score to govern access to social goods, is consistent. The tools built in Gotham do not stay in Gotham. This is the thing the film cannot quite dramatize, because it is set in one city and one story. But the logic the film is examining, that surveillance tools built for specific purposes expand into general-purpose control systems when the people operating them face no meaningful check on that expansion, is a logic that moves across borders. In The Dark Knight, the sonar surveillance system covers one city for one night. Lucius Fox destroys it at the moment of its success, before it can become normal. Before the people of Gotham can grow accustomed to being monitored. Before the next threat can be used to justify keeping the system running a little longer. Before the temporary becomes the permanent. This is the film at its most quietly idealistic. The self-destruct is its fantasy. The idea that the person who built the tool is also the person who destroys it at the moment of greatest temptation to keep it, when it has just worked, when the threat that justified it is neutralized, when the case for keeping it just one more day is at its strongest, is the film's dream of what responsible power looks like. China's system has no self-destruct. The Patriot Act had no self-destruct. Cambridge Analytica's database had no self-destruct. The NSA's collection infrastructure has no self-destruct. In each case, the people who built the tool had reasons to keep it. Good reasons, by the logic of the system they were operating inside. The threat might return. The data might be useful. The investment was significant. The next emergency was always potentially just ahead. The film knows this. It knows that the self-destruct in the story is a wish rather than a prediction. Lucius Fox gets to type his name and watch the screens go dark. That moment is satisfying, precisely because it is rare. Because the version of events where the person with the power uses it to limit their own power is the exception, not the rule. The exception matters, though. The ferry passengers who refused to press the button matter. Lucius Fox's resignation threat matters. The single senator who voted against the Patriot Act matters. These moments do not change the large pattern. They exist inside it as proof that the pattern is not total, that the system does not always win, that the bad barrel does not corrupt every apple. But the pattern is still the pattern, and understanding it requires looking not just at the tools themselves, but at the people who build them. At what happens to good people when they are placed inside systems that are running too fast for anyone to read the bill before voting, or too secret for anyone outside to know what is being built, or too large for any single person's objection to slow down. That question, what happens to the good person inside the bad institution, has one more dimension that the film examines and that the history confirms. The dimension that is not about surveillance or legislation or political systems at all. The dimension that is purely about obedience. About what ordinary people will do when they are standing at the switch and the man in the lab coat says continue, and they know, somewhere deep down, that continuing is wrong. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That dimension has a name. Hannah Arendt gave it one in 1963, watching a quiet bureaucrat explain how he had helped organize the murder of millions of people. She called it the banality of evil. And it is the most disturbing piece of the puzzle the film is assembling. Section 7. The terrifyingly normal. In 1961, a man named Adolf Eichmann sat in a glass booth in a courtroom in Jerusalem and explained himself. Eichmann had been one of the primary organizers of the Holocaust. His specific job within the Nazi bureaucracy had been the logistics of transportation. Getting Jewish people from their homes and communities across Europe onto trains, and getting those trains to the concentration camps. He had not designed the camps. He had not given the order for the Holocaust to happen. He had managed the paperwork and the schedules and the coordination between different government departments that made the transportation run efficiently. He had, through this work, contributed directly to the murder of millions of people. At his trial, Eichmann did not present himself as a monster. He did not express hatred. He did not describe a burning belief in the ideology that had produced the Holocaust. He described himself as a man who had followed orders, done his job, worked within the system he had been placed inside, and obeyed the chain of command above him. He said he had been raised to obey the law. He said the people around him were doing the same things he was doing. He said that by taking commands from others, he had avoided feeling personally responsible for the results of his daily work. Hannah Arendt was in that courtroom. She was a philosopher and a journalist, born in Germany, who had fled the Nazi regime in the 1930s and built a career in the United States studying totalitarianism and political violence. She had been sent to Jerusalem by the New Yorker magazine to cover the trial. She expected to find a monster. She expected the face behind the Holocaust's logistics to be something recognizably dark, something with the visible stamp of genuine evil on it. What she found was a quiet, ordinary-looking bureaucrat who could barely put a sentence together without reaching for a cliché. He spoke in stock phrases and official language. When he tried to express something personal, he reached instead for the language of the office, the language of procedure, the language of a man who had spent so long inside an institution that the institution had replaced his inner life. She wrote about this in a series of articles for The New Yorker in 1963, which were later collected into a book. The phrase she used to describe what she saw has become one of the most discussed ideas in the history of philosophy. She called it the banality of evil. Banal means ordinary, commonplace, boring, the opposite of dramatic. The word is usually used to describe things that are unremarkable to the point of being dull. Hannah Arendt used it to describe evil because the evil she witnessed in that courtroom was exactly that: unremarkable, boring, produced not by a dramatic decision to do terrible things, but by the quiet, grinding absence of any decision at all. Eichmann had not chosen evil. He had simply stopped choosing. He had handed the choosing to the institution around him and done his job. Her argument was precise, and it disturbed a great many people when she made it, because it pointed towards something that most people found deeply uncomfortable. The Holocaust was not produced by a small number of uniquely cruel people with uniquely dark inner lives. It was produced by a large bureaucracy, staffed by ordinary people who followed instructions, completed paperwork, met deadlines, and went home to their families. The system shaped them. The roles they played defined what they did. And because the evil was distributed across thousands of people, each doing their small part, no single person had to face the full weight of what they were collectively producing. Eichmann organized transportation. Someone else wrote the orders. Someone else ran the camps. Someone else gave the speeches. Each person in the chain did their job. The jobs connected to each other and produced the Holocaust. And when it was over, almost every person in the chain had a version of Eichmann's defense available to them. They had followed the rules they had been given, within the system they had been placed inside, doing what the people above them had authorized. Arendt was not arguing that Eichmann was innocent. She was arguing that the explanation of how the Holocaust happened, the explanation that located the cause in the extreme evil of a few exceptional individuals, was wrong. And that being wrong about the cause meant being wrong about the prevention. If genocide requires monsters, then as long as you can identify the monsters and remove them, you are safe. If genocide can be produced by ordinary people following ordinary institutional logic, then the danger is everywhere that institutions exist, and the pressure to comply is strong enough. The Dark Knight puts this argument on screen in a form that is accessible and immediate, and completely consistent with what Arendt observed in Jerusalem. The Joker is not Eichmann. The Joker is the opposite of Eichmann. He is all choice, all agency, all decision. A person who has stripped away every institutional loyalty and every social obligation and acts from pure individual will. The film presents this as terrifying, and it is terrifying. But the film is also careful to show that the Joker is not the primary danger. The primary danger is the people around him who are following orders. The corrupt cops in Gotham's police force are not villains in the traditional sense. They are people who made a series of small compromises over time, accepted money here, looked the other way there, passed information along when asked. Each compromise made within a system that normalized it. By the time Joker is manipulating them into betraying dense location, they have been so thoroughly shaped by the corrupt structure around them that the betrayal feels like business, not a dramatic choice, a business transaction. When one of the corrupt officers is asked why he did what he did, the implicit answer the film gives is the same answer Eichmann gave. The system, the chain, the way things work. Not, I decided to help the Joker. More like, this is what people in my position do, in a city like this, in a system like this, and I did it. The ordinary cop who follows orders that produce terrible outcomes. The ordinary soldier who follows instructions that produce torture. The ordinary lawyer who finds legal justification for things the law was previously designed to prevent. The ordinary analyst who processes surveillance data on millions of people who have not consented to being watched. None of them decided to be evil. All of them did their jobs. The jobs connected to each other and produced the outcome. Arendt's argument has a specific application to the sequence of events documented across the previous sections of this essay that is worth making explicit. The lawyers who wrote the memos authorizing torture at Guantanamo were not people who wanted to torture anyone. They were legal professionals doing their jobs inside a system that had been restructured by emergency to demand a specific result. The system needed a legal justification for crossing a line the law had previously drawn. Their job was to find one. They found one. The line was crossed. They went back to their offices. The NSA analysts who collected data on hundreds of millions of people who had not consented to surveillance were not people who wanted to invade anyone's privacy. They were doing their jobs inside a system that had been built to do exactly what they were doing. The system had been authorized through a process, secret courts, classified legislation, classified rulings, that gave their work the appearance of legitimacy. They had clearances, they had protocols, they had the institutional authority of the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth, telling them that what they were doing was both legal and necessary. They did their jobs. The soldiers at Abu Ghraib were not recruited from the population of people who wanted to abuse prisoners. They were ordinary military personnel placed inside an institution that had been restructured through a chain of memos and orders and authorized techniques to permit and in some cases encourage methods that their training and their values would not previously have allowed. The commanding general issued orders to manipulate detainees' emotions and weaknesses. Military intelligence personnel told the military police to set the conditions. The soldiers set the conditions. The conditions produced abuse. Each person in the chain did their job. Arendt would have recognized every one of these chains instantly. The structure, the roles, the distributed responsibility that allowed each person to avoid the full weight of the collective outcome. The language of necessity and emergency and threat that made the behavior feel authorized rather than chosen. The Milgram experiments provide the measurable version of what Arendt observed philosophically. 65% of ordinary American people, with no particular cruelty in them, pressed a button they believed was delivering potentially lethal electric shocks to a stranger because a man in a lab coat told them the experiment required it. They were not evil. They were compliant. They were doing what the structure around them said was expected, following the authority in the room, avoiding the responsibility of individual choice by deferring to the role they had been given. Milgram's own conclusion echoed Arendt's almost exactly. He wrote that ordinary people, simply doing their jobs without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. He wrote that even when the destructive effects of their work become clearly visible, relatively few people have the resources to resist authority. The resources to resist authority. That phrase is important. Milgram did not say people lacked the desire to resist. Many of his participants showed extreme distress. They did not want to continue pressing the button. What they lacked was something structural, a way of locating their own individual moral judgment as more authoritative than the institutional permission around them. The man in the lab coat represented the institution. The institution said continue. Most people continued. There is a moment in the dark night that is easy to watch and almost impossible to fully absorb, because it moves quickly, and the film is always moving quickly. Near the end of the film, the Joker has rigged the two fairies. He is hanging upside down from a high floor of a building, having just been caught by Batman. He looks up at Batman, or down at him from his inverted perspective, and he says something that most people remember as a villain being defiant after capture. He says that Batman has changed things, that there is no going back, that the criminals of Gotham now know that the rules have changed, that by operating outside the law, Batman has shown everyone that the law is optional when the stakes are high enough, and that whatever Batman intended by this, whatever good he was trying to do, the precedent he set will be used by people whose intentions are very different. The Joker is not wrong about this. He is making a precise observation about the nature of precedent and institutional logic. When Batman crosses a line, kidnapping, torture, mass surveillance, operating as a vigilante without legal accountability, he does not just cross it for himself. He demonstrates that the line can be crossed. He establishes that the emergency justifies the crossing. And once that demonstration has been made, the logic is available to anyone who can claim an emergency and construct a justification. This is what Hannah Arendt meant when she wrote that the danger of the banality of evil is not just that it exists, but that it scales. An individual monster is limited by their individual capacity for harm. An institution staffed by ordinary people following ordinary institutional logic, in which the behavior has been normalized and the responsibility has been distributed, scales as far as the institution reaches. And modern institutions, governments, intelligence agencies, militaries, technology companies, reach very far. The specific element of Arendt's argument that most people miss, because the phrase banality of evil is so striking that it tends to dominate the discussion, is what she said was the antidote. She argued that the opposite of the thoughtlessness she saw in Eichmann, the absence of genuine reflection, the replacement of individual moral judgment with institutional compliance, was thinking. Specifically, thinking from the standpoint of another person. Imagining what the experience of the person on the other side of your action actually is. Eichmann had organized the transportation of millions of people to their deaths, and had never, as far as Arendt could determine, genuinely tried to imagine what those people experienced. He had seen them as a logistical problem to be solved, not as people to be thought about. The thinking had been switched off by the role. She said this about him: he could not think from the standpoint of anyone else. He lacked the ability or the willingness to see things from the perspective of the people his work affected. The antidote, in her view, was not heroism or unusual moral strength. It was the ordinary, everyday practice of asking what this looks like from the other side. What does the person receiving this feel? What is the experience of the person whose phone I am tapping, whose data I am collecting, whose body I am holding in a prison without charging them with a crime. This is what Lucius Fox does in the server room. He does not stand there as a hero. He stands there as a man who is capable of imagining what it feels like to have your phone converted into a surveillance device without your knowledge. He can take the standpoint of the ordinary citizen of Gotham, and when he does, he finds the system intolerable, regardless of who built it or why. This is also what the prisoner on the ferry does when he takes the detonator from the guard and throws it in the river. He does not press the button, not because he is unusually brave or moral, but because he can imagine what the people on the other ferry feel. The empathy is the resistance. Arendt's book was published in 1963. It was immediately controversial. Many readers, especially in the Jewish community, felt that her portrait of Eichmann as an ordinary bureaucrat was a kind of excuse, that it minimized his guilt, that it let him off the hook by attributing his crimes to the system rather than to him personally. She spent years clarifying that she had not meant this. She was not arguing that Eichmann bore no responsibility. She was arguing that his responsibility was real, and that the explanation of it as the product of monstrous individual evil was too simple to be useful. Useful is the key word. The question she was asking was not just what happened, but how to prevent it from happening again. And the prevention requires an accurate diagnosis of the cause. If the cause was Eichmann's individual monstrosity, then removing Eichmann removes the danger. If the cause was the institutional structure that shaped his behavior and distributed his responsibility across thousands of ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, then the danger remains wherever that kind of structure exists. The structure exists everywhere. In governments and corporations and militaries and police forces and intelligence agencies. The structure is not inherently evil. Institutions are necessary. The question is what the institution normalizes, what behaviors the role makes automatic, what the person inside the institution stops thinking about because the institution has told them it does not require thought. The film ends with a lie that has become the foundation of Gotham's peace. It ends with Batman running from a city that believes something false about its own history. It ends with Gordon telling his son that Batman is a villain, knowing that the opposite is true, because the truth is too complicated and too damaging to tell. This ending is Arendt's argument in its final form. The people who built the Order, Batman, Gordon, Dent in his original form, stopped thinking at the crucial moment from the standpoint of Gotham's citizens. They decided, for the citizens, what the citizens could handle knowing. They substituted their own judgment for the public's right to the truth. They became, in that moment, the schemers the Joker had always said they were, making choices on behalf of people who had not been asked. The Joker wanted to prove that order is always built on hidden choices made by people who have decided they know best. The ending of the film proves him right about Gotham. The essay so far has made the case that he is right about a great deal more than Gotham. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the Joker was wrong about the ferry, and that wrongness matters. The next section is about where his argument breaks down, about the documented, verifiable cases where the system did not win, where ordinary people found the resources to resist authority, where the Lucius Fox moment actually happened and the machine actually went dark. Section 8. The ones who threw the detonator away. The Joker was certain about the ferries. He had engineered the situation with the same precision he brought to everything else in the film. 2 boats. 2 populations chosen to maximize the likelihood of conflict. Civilians on one, convicted prisoners on the other. 2 detonators, each capable of destroying the opposite boat. A deadline, a radio, and his voice, calm and amused, explaining the rules. His certainty was not irrational. It was based on everything he believed about human nature, everything he had observed about how people behave when the structure around them collapses and survival becomes the operating logic. He had watched Gotham's citizens panic when he threatened the mayor. He had watched Harvey Dent, the best person the city had, pick up a gun and start flipping a coin to decide who lived. He had watched Batman build a mass surveillance system and call it necessary. His evidence up to that point was good. The fairies did not press the button. A large man on the civilian ferry walked to the front of the boat, took the detonator from a guard, and threw it into the river. He did not make a speech. He did not explain himself at length. He walked up, took the device, and threw it away. And then he went and sat back down. On the prison ferry, a prisoner asked the guard for the detonator and received it, and he also threw it into the river. And he sat back down. The Joker had been wrong. Not about everything, but about this. And the film is careful to present this wrongness not as a triumph, but as a complication. The fairies did not explode. Harvey Dent still became Two-Face. Both things happened in the same film, on the same night, and the film holds both of them without resolving the tension between them. The fairy moment is the film's evidence for the other side of the argument. The case that ordinary people, faced with a visible and immediate choice, can refuse the logic of the system and act from something the system did not account for. The evidence for this side of the argument is not limited to a fictional boat. Russ Feingold was a senator from Wisconsin. On October 25, 2001, 45 days after the September 11th attacks, he was the only member of the United States Senate to vote against the USA Patriot Act. The vote was 98-1. He knew before he cast his vote that it would be 98-1. He cast it anyway. His statement on the Senate floor that day was careful and specific. He said he supported the effort to find and stop those responsible for the attacks. He said he understood the urgency. He said he recognized that doing nothing was not an option. And then he said that the bill in front of the Senate had been written too fast, without adequate consideration of its effects on civil liberties, and that a democracy that abandoned its principles in the name of defending them had already lost something it could not easily recover. He said that some of the bill's provisions would allow the government to conduct surveillance of American citizens in ways that the Constitution had specifically been designed to prevent. He said that the safeguards that had been built into American law over generations to prevent exactly this kind of overreach were being stripped out in a matter of days, under pressure, without real debate. He was right about all of it. The appellate court ruling in 2015 that found the mass phone data collection under Section 215 of the Patriot Act unlawful confirmed 14 years later what Feingold said on the floor in 2001. The thing he warned about had happened exactly as he described it would. He threw the detonator in the river. The vote passed without him. The bill became law. His vote changed nothing about the outcome in the immediate term. It mattered anyway, because the record of what was said and who said it and what they knew when they said it is part of the historical account of how these decisions were made. And because the act of one person standing in a room of 99 people and saying, "This is wrong," on the record, when it would have been enormously easier and politically safer to say nothing, is the same act that the man on the civilian ferry performed when he walked to the front of the boat. Thomas Drake worked for the National Security Agency. He was a senior executive there with a high-level security clearance, and he had access to information about how the agency's surveillance programs were being run. In the early 2000s, he became concerned that the agency was pursuing a surveillance approach that was far broader than it needed to be, that collected data on American citizens in ways that were not legally authorized, and that was costing enormous amounts of money, while producing results that a more targeted approach could have achieved more efficiently. He raised his concerns internally. He went through the proper channels: the Inspector General's office, congressional oversight committees, the people inside the system whose job was to receive exactly this kind of concern and take it seriously. His concerns were not taken seriously. The programs continued. He eventually provided information to a reporter at the Baltimore Sun. He did not provide classified documents. He was careful about this, working through channels he believed were legally protected for whistleblowers. In 2010, the Obama administration charged him under the Espionage Act with 10 counts that carried the potential for 35 years in prison. The charges were based on his having retained documents that the government considered classified, even though Drake maintained that the documents he kept were not classified at the time he kept them. In 2011, all 10 major charges against him were dropped. He pleaded guilty to a single minor charge of exceeding his authorized use of a government computer. He was sentenced to community service and probation. The judge in the case said from the bench that what had happened to Drake was a tragedy, that a problem that could have been addressed through congressional oversight had instead been turned into a criminal prosecution of a man who had tried to raise legitimate concerns through legitimate channels. Drake lost his career. He lost his security clearance. He spent years under the threat of a decades-long prison sentence. He had thrown the detonator away, and the system that owned the detonator had spent years trying to make him regret it. Edward Snowden is the most famous version of this story. His case has been covered extensively in earlier sections of this essay. But what belongs here, in the section about people who threw the detonator away, is the specific texture of what he gave up and what he received in return. Snowden was 29 years old when he began copying documents. He was working at one of the most prestigious and well-paying positions available to someone with his technical skills. He was living in Hawaii with his girlfriend. He had, by his own account, a comfortable and satisfying life. He was not a person with nothing to lose. He was a person who made a calculated decision to give up a great deal in exchange for the possibility that the public would know something he believed they had a right to know. He has said in interviews and in his memoir that the moment that decided it for him was watching James Clapper lie to Congress under oath. He said that at that point, he understood that the internal channels, the Inspector General, the oversight committees, the mechanisms that theoretically existed to receive and act on the concerns of people inside the system, had been bypassed or neutralized. That the only channel left was the public itself, and the only way to reach the public was through journalists. He flew to Hong Kong. He met with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and Barton Gellman and Ewan McCaskill. He handed them the documents. He then checked into a hotel room and waited to find out what would happen to him. He has lived in Russia since 2013, unable to return to the United States without facing charges under the Espionage Act that carry the potential for decades in prison. He was granted Russian citizenship in 2022. The United States government still considers him a criminal. The Guardian and the Washington Post won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for reporting his story. He received no equivalent recognition from the government, whose citizens he had informed. The ferry passengers who refused to press the button did not get rewarded in the film either. Nobody made a speech about their courage. The Joker was not impressed. The night continued to be dangerous, and people continued to die. They refused the button, and the night went on. That is the complete description of what refusing the button gives you. You did not press it, and the night goes on. Christophe Mailly was a security guard at a Swiss bank in 1997. The bank was in the process of shredding documents related to assets that had been deposited by Jewish families during the Second World War. Assets that the families, or their descendants, had been trying to reclaim for decades. Mailly saw what was being shredded. He took some of the documents home rather than allowing them to be destroyed. He brought them to a Jewish organization in Zurich. The bank pressed criminal charges against him in Switzerland for violating Swiss banking secrecy laws. He and his family received death threats. He was forced to flee Switzerland with his wife and children, and eventually received asylum in the United States, where he and his family rebuilt their lives essentially from nothing. The documents he saved contributed to an eventual settlement between Swiss banks and Holocaust survivors and their families that totaled $1.25 billion. Thousands of families received some portion of assets that had been held for decades and that the banks had been in the process of destroying the evidence of. When Mailly intervened, he had worked a night shift as a security guard and had seen something wrong and had picked up the documents instead of walking past them. He was not a politician or a lawyer or a powerful person. He was a person with a job inside a system who decided in a specific moment that the system's logic, shred the documents, maintain secrecy, do the job, was less authoritative than what he could see with his own eyes. These cases share a structure that is worth identifying because it maps onto the fairy moment in the film with some precision. In every case, the person who threw the detonator away was operating inside a system that had clear momentum in a specific direction. The Senate was voting 98-1. The surveillance programs were running. The bank was shredding. The system had authorization, precedent, institutional weight, and in most cases, legal protection. The person who objected had none of those things on their side. They had their own judgment, their own assessment of what they were seeing, and a decision about whether their judgment was more authoritative than the system's momentum. In every case, they paid a significant personal cost. Feingold's vote did not save him from later losing his Senate seat. Drake spent years under threat of a 35-year prison sentence. Snowden has lived in exile for over a decade. Mailly fled his country and started over in a foreign country with his family. The ferry passengers in the film gained nothing material from their refusal. They simply remained on a boat that had not exploded, in a city that was still dangerous, on a night that was still terrible. This is the thing that makes these moments morally significant, rather than strategically clever. The people who pressed the button would have been doing what the system rewarded. The people who threw the detonator away were doing something the system punished. The choice was made not because it was safe or beneficial, but because of something that exists in people independently of what the system around them is producing. Hannah Arendt called that something thinking. The ability to take the standpoint of another person, to ask what this looks like from the other side, to refuse the role's logic long enough to apply your own. The Milgram experiments, which showed that 65% of ordinary people would press the shock button all the way to the maximum voltage, also showed that 35% would not. This number tends to get lost in discussions of the experiment because the 65% is the alarming finding and the 35% sounds like a consolation. But 35% of ordinary Americans, in a room with an authority figure in a lab coat, under significant social pressure, with no particular training or preparation, refused to continue when their own moral judgment told them to stop. Milgram studied what changed the numbers. when the person being shocked was in the same room as the person pressing the button, when the distance was removed and the teacher could see the learner's face, the compliance rate dropped to 40%. When the authority figure was not in the room and gave instructions only by telephone, compliance dropped further still. When other participants, who were also actors, openly refused to continue, the compliance rate among real participants dropped to 10%. That last finding is the most important one for the purposes of this section. When one person in a group refuses, openly, in front of others, the refusal becomes available to everyone else as a model. The social permission that the authority figure had been providing, the institutional cover that made pressing the button feel like the expected and acceptable thing to do, was countered by a different kind of social permission. The permission to say no. The proof that no was an option. Feingold's vote was 1 in 99. It did not stop the bill, but it put on the public record, in front of everyone watching, that a senator of the United States had stood up and said, "This is wrong, and I will not vote for it." That record existed. People who came later and wanted to challenge the act could point to it. The no was available as a model in a way it would not have been if the vote had been 99-0. The film's ferry scene is not the climax of The Dark Knight. It happens before the final confrontation with the Joker, before the revelation of Two-Face, before the lie about Dent, and the ending with Batman running into the dark. The ferries are resolved relatively quickly, and the night continues to be terrible. And the film does not treat the refusal to press the button as a solution to anything. This is the film being honest about what individual acts of moral resistance actually accomplish. The large man who threw the detonator into the river did not save Gotham. He saved the people on the other ferry. The night went on. Harvey Dent still became Two-Face. The lie was still told. Batman still ran. Individual resistance to systemic pressure is real, and it matters, and it costs the people who practice it enormously. It also does not, by itself, change the system. Feingold's vote did not stop the Patriot Act. Snowden's documents changed the public conversation about surveillance, but did not dismantle the surveillance apparatus. Drake's concerns, raised through every proper channel available to him, were met with criminal prosecution rather than reform. The system changes when the individual resistance accumulates into something structural. When enough people, in enough positions, refuse clearly enough and publicly enough, that the institutional logic itself shifts. When the 35% becomes visible enough that the 65% starts to reconsider. That shift is slow. It is incomplete. It is frequently reversed. But the evidence across the history examined in this essay suggests that it happens. Courts eventually rule unlawful what was once accepted. Oversight mechanisms eventually demand answers that were once not given. Whistleblowers eventually reach audiences that change the terms of public debate. The barrel does not always win. The film's argument is not that systems always corrupt and people never resist. Its argument is more precise than that. It is that the tools built for emergencies tend to outlast the emergencies that justified them. That the noble lie tends to become the foundation of the peace that follows it. That the person willing to stand in a Senate chamber and vote no when everyone else votes yes will almost certainly lose the immediate battle and should be prepared to pay a significant personal price for losing it. And that doing it anyway is what distinguishes the people who threw the detonator from the people who pressed the button. The question the film has been building toward since the opening bank robbery, and the question that all of this history has been circling, is not whether resistance is possible. The ferry proves it is. The question is what happens to the places and systems where nobody throws the detonator, where the vote is 99-0, where the surveillance program runs for 6 years before anyone finds out it exists, where the lie about the dead hero holds for 8 years and the peace built on it is considered a success. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What does a city look like when the lie finally comes due? What does a system built on hidden choices cost when the hidden choices are eventually exposed? That is where the film ends, and it is, in a way only visible now, exactly where the real world has been heading since a bill nobody had time to read was signed on a morning in October 2001. Section 9. 8 Years of Silence. The Dark Knight Rises opens 8 years after the night Harvey Dent died. Gotham is peaceful. The streets are clean in a way they never were during the mob years. The criminals that Dent put away are still in prison, kept there by the Dent Act. Legislation passed in the wake of his death that stripped away the possibility of parole for the city's most dangerous offenders. Commissioner Gordon gives a speech at a public ceremony honoring Dent's memory. He holds a piece of paper in his hands, the real speech, the true one, the one that tells Gotham what actually happened on the night Dent died. He looks at the crowd. He folds the paper and puts it in his pocket. He gives the other speech instead, the one about the hero. Bruce Wayne has not put on the Batman suit in 8 years. He lives as a recluse in Wayne Manor, walking with a cane, having absorbed the cost of the lie into his body somehow, as if the weight of carrying it has become physical. The city does not know he exists in any meaningful way anymore. The peace is real. The foundation it sits on is not. This is the film's most honest structural argument. Not the Joker's speeches, not the surveillance machine, not the fairy. The 8 years of silence between the second and third films is where the warning lives. Because 8 years is long enough that the lie starts to feel like history. Long enough that the people who were there begin to half believe the story they have been telling. Long enough that the peace starts to feel like proof that the method worked and the cost was acceptable, and there is no bill coming due. The bill comes due in the first 20 minutes of The Dark Knight Rises. The pattern that the film is dramatizing across those 8 years has a real-world shape that is now well documented and worth examining in full. When the Patriot Act was signed in October of 2001, the administration that signed it described the measures as temporary responses to an emergency. The emergency, by most definitions, referred to the immediate threat environment following the September 11th attacks, the period when the intelligence agencies did not know whether more attacks were planned, who was planning them, or where they might happen. That period of maximum uncertainty lasted, by most assessments, months rather than years. The surveillance powers lasted decades. By 2013, when Snowden's documents revealed the scope of what had been built, the NSA's mass data collection had been running for 6 years. The legal justifications for it had been reviewed and extended by 2 administrations, one Republican and one Democratic. The secret court that was supposed to provide oversight had approved the programs with almost no dissent. The intelligence committees in Congress that were theoretically briefed on the programs had largely accepted the briefings without demanding changes. The emergency had long since receded. The architecture built for the emergency had not. The temporary had become, through the accumulation of renewals and extensions and quiet expansions, the permanent baseline. And because it had happened gradually, in classified settings, out of public view, there was no single dramatic moment when anyone could point and say, this is where the emergency measure became the permanent condition. It just happened. The way things always just happen when nobody is watching. Gordon's folded speech in the opening of The Dark Knight Rises is the film's image for this process. The true account exists. It was written. It was carried to the podium. And then it was put away, because the moment for telling it had been assessed by one man acting alone, without asking the people who deserved to hear it, has not yet arrived. The logic of the delay is always impeccable in the moment. The city needs stability right now. Telling the truth would destabilize things. The criminals Dent put away would have grounds for appeal. The hope the city has built its recovery on would be shaken. Later, when things are more settled, when the foundation is stronger, when the timing is better, then the truth can come out. Later never arrives on its own. Later requires something to force it. In Gotham, what forces it is Bane, a villain who has obtained the truth and weaponizes it, reading Gordon's real speech over a public address system to a city that has spent 8 years being told a different story. The truth does not arrive as a considered, dignified disclosure from the people who held it. It arrives as a weapon in someone else's hands. This is how suppressed truths tend to arrive in reality as well. In 2004, a journalist named Seymour Hersh published an article in The New Yorker that described in detail what had been happening at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. The photographs that CBS News had already broadcast showed the surface of the abuse. Hersh's reporting went into the internal documents, the memos, the orders, the chain of authorization that had produced the conditions at Abu Ghraib. The administration's response was to describe what had happened as the work of a few bad apples, isolated individuals whose behavior did not reflect the policies or the values of the military or the government. This framing located the cause in individual deviance rather than institutional design. It was the same framing that Philip Zimbardo had spent his career arguing was wrong. It was the framing that allowed the institution to survive the exposure largely intact. Because if the problem was a few individuals, removing those individuals solved the problem. The individuals were removed. 11 soldiers were charged. Most received sentences that were measured in months rather than years. The commanding officers who had created the conditions were largely not charged. The lawyers who had written the legal memos authorizing the treatment of detainees continued their careers. The private contractors who had participated in the interrogations faced almost no consequences. The institution that had produced the conditions was assessed by the institution as having addressed the problem by removing the individuals. The assessment was accepted widely enough that the institutional architecture, the detention without trial, the enhanced interrogation framework, the legal memos that had authorized crossing lines the law had previously treated as uncrossable, remained largely in place. What Hersh's reporting revealed, and what the subsequent military investigations confirmed, was that the abuse at Abu Ghraib had not been produced by aberrant individuals acting outside the system. It had been produced by the system. The system had issued the orders to set the conditions. The system had created the environment. The system had distributed the responsibility across enough people and enough levels of command that no single person had to hold the full weight of what they were collectively producing. The bad apple's framing held just long enough for the moment of maximum public pressure to pass. Then the system continued. The noble lie that this had been exceptional rather than systemic bought the institution the time it needed to survive the exposure without fundamental change. Gotham's noble lie buys 8 years. The administration's framing of Abu Ghraib bought enough time for the public attention to move elsewhere. The NSA's classified legal justifications bought 6 years before Snowden. The common element across all of these cases is time. The lie, or the suppression, or the classified framework, or the emergency justification does not need to hold forever. It needs to hold long enough for the moment of maximum pressure to pass, long enough for the public to move on to the next emergency, the next news cycle, the next thing demanding attention, long enough for the people making the decisions to have moved on to other roles, retired, or otherwise placed themselves outside the reach of the accountability that the truth would have brought. The architects of the Patriot Act's most expansive interpretations were, by the time the 2015 appellate court ruled those interpretations unlawful, no longer in the positions from which they had made those interpretations. The lawyers who wrote the enhanced interrogation memos had returned to private practice or moved to other government roles. The officials who had overseen the construction of the NSA's mass collection architecture had retired or transitioned out of government. The institution absorbed the cost. The individuals dispersed. This is the Batman problem in its most structural form. Bruce Wayne runs into the dark, carrying the guilt for Harvey Dent's crimes. He carries it alone, in his body, in 8 years of self-imposed exile. The institution, Gotham, the law, the Dent Act, operates cleanly above this individual cost, producing real benefits, maintaining real peace, as if the foundation is solid. The cost of the lie is paid entirely by the person who chose to tell it, not by the system that benefited from it. The Dent Act locked up hundreds of criminals. The peace it produced was real. Gotham, under the Dent Act, is, by every visible measure, a safer and more functional city than the Gotham of the first 2 films. This is the thing the film is careful to show, because it is the thing that makes the lie genuinely complicated rather than simply wrong. If the lie had produced nothing, if the 8 years had been miserable, if the Dent Act had been a failure, if Gotham had remained dangerous and broken, then the argument against the lie would be easy. The foundation was rotten and the building fell. Simple. The building did not fall. The foundation was rotten and the building stood for 8 years, producing genuine stability and genuine safety for the people living inside it. This is the hardest version of the argument to make honestly, because acknowledging that the lie worked, that it produced real good, is the necessary precondition for making the case that it was still wrong to tell it. The Patriot Act's surveillance powers produced some genuine intelligence results. The NSA's programs identified some real threats. Guantanamo held some people who had been genuinely involved in planning violence. The institutions built on compromised foundations produced, alongside the abuses, some of the results they were designed to produce. Dismissing everything they did as worthless is inaccurate and makes the argument weaker than it needs to be. The argument against the lie, in the film and in reality, is not that it produced nothing good. The argument is about the foundation, about what happens when the thing the piece is built on is eventually exposed, about who pays the cost when the bill finally arrives, about the fact that a city or a society that does not know the true basis of its peace cannot make informed decisions about how to preserve or improve it, cannot correct the problems in the system because the system's problems have been classified or covered up or folded into a pocket before a watching crowd. In 2013, when Snowden's documents were published, the immediate response from the intelligence community and from members of both political parties was to describe what he had done as treason. The programs he had exposed were described as essential tools for national security. The suggestion that they had been built on legally questionable foundations was disputed loudly by the people who had built them. Over the following months and years, the picture changed. The 2015 appellate court ruling found the mass phone data collection unlawful. An independent review panel, appointed by President Obama in 2013, found that the mass collection program had not been essential to preventing attacks, and that all leads generated could have been obtained through more targeted methods. The very justification at the center of the program's existence, that it was necessary because conventional methods were insufficient, was found by a panel the administration itself appointed to be unsupported by the evidence. The 8 years of Gotham's peace rested on Harvey Dent's reputation. The mass surveillance architecture rested on the claim that it was essential to national security. Both foundations were examined more carefully than their builders had anticipated, and both were found to be significantly less solid than the structures built on top of them had required them to be. Bane reads Gordon's speech over the public address system, and Gotham convulses. The appellate court ruling and the independent review panel's findings received considerably less dramatic public attention. This is one of the ways that reality and film diverge. The exposure of a suppressed truth in reality rarely arrives with the theatrical force of a villain with a public address system. It arrives in court decisions and review panel reports, and declassified documents, and journalism that most people do not read in full. The lack of drama does not change the nature of what is exposed. The foundation was what it was, regardless of how quietly the inspection report was delivered. Gordon carries the folded speech in his pocket for 8 years. He knows what it says. He knows what the city does not know. And he lives inside that knowledge, serving as commissioner, making decisions every day inside a system whose legitimacy rests on something he knows to be false. This is the moral condition of everyone who participates in maintaining a noble lie over time. The people who knew the scope of the NSA's surveillance programs and classified that knowledge. The lawyers who knew the legal memos authorizing torture and kept them classified. The officials who knew the true basis of the detention system at Guantanamo and described it publicly as a careful and legitimate response to an extraordinary threat. They carried their folded speeches to the podium every time they spoke publicly. They gave the other speech, and they lived inside the knowledge of what the other speech said. The cost of that, to them personally, is not something the public record captures well. What the public record does capture is what it costs the institutions they were protecting. Because institutions built on suppressed truths become, over time, incapable of honest self-assessment, incapable of identifying and correcting their own failures, because correcting the failure would require acknowledging the foundation. The cover story calcifies into the official history. The official history shapes future decisions, and future decisions made on the basis of the official history rather than the actual history produce results that cannot be understood or corrected without going back to the foundation. Gotham passes the Dent Act. The Dent Act produces peace. The peace produces the assumption that the methods that produced the peace were sound. The assumption shapes future policy. And then Bane arrives, and the assumption meets the reality, and the distance between them is where the damage lives. The film ends not with a solution, but with a continuation. Bruce Wayne is alive, somewhere, having been given the ending he earned rather than the ending the city gave him. Gordon knows the truth now. Bane forced it into the open. The city knows. The lie is over. What the film does not show, because it ends in the moment of revelation rather than in its aftermath, is what Gotham does next. How a city processes the discovery that the peace it lived inside for 8 years was built on something other than what it was told. How institutions reform themselves, or fail to, when the suppressed truth finally arrives. Whether the people who were locked up under the Dent Act have any recourse. Whether the legacy of a law built on a lie can be untangled from the genuine good it produced. These are not questions with clean answers in the film or in reality. The 2015 ruling that the NSA's phone data collection was unlawful did not result in the destruction of the data that had been collected. The finding that the enhanced interrogation program had not produced the results its architects claimed did not result in the prosecution of the lawyers who had authorized it. The exposure of Cambridge Analytica's methods did not undo the elections the methods had been used to influence. The lies end. The consequences of the things done while the lies held do not end with them. This is the gap between the film's ending, where the lie is exposed and Bruce Wayne escapes to a life somewhere warm, and the reality that the history of the last 25 years has produced. The exposure is not the conclusion. The exposure is the beginning of a much longer and much less dramatic reckoning with what was built while nobody was watching. The film has made its argument across 8 sections. The Joker identified the logic of order. The experiments showed how ordinary people become agents of systems they would not individually choose. The Patriot Act showed how emergency measures become permanent architecture. Harvey Dent showed how the best person in the room becomes the worst when the structure around them is destroyed. Cambridge Analytica showed how the surveillance tool migrates from governments to corporations. China showed what the tool looks like with no off switch. Arendt showed how ordinary people participate in terrible things without deciding to be terrible. The resistors showed that the detonator can be thrown away and what it costs to throw it. What remains is the question the film raises and cannot answer, because no film can. The question of what the warning is actually for. What watching a story about order's dangers is supposed to produce in the person watching it. Whether understanding the pattern changes the pattern, or whether the pattern runs deeper than understanding. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That question is where this essay ends. And the answer, such as it is, lives not in the film's plot, but in the specific craft choices Nolan made in how the story is told. Choices that reveal what he believed about the audience watching, what he thought they were capable of, and what he hoped the story would leave them with when the credits rolled and the lights came up. Section 10. What the Dark Knight was warning about. The Dark Knight ends with Batman running. He has just saved a boy's life. He has stopped Harvey Dent from killing Commissioner Gordon's son. He has, in the most immediate sense, won. The Joker is in custody. The fairies did not explode. The city is safe for another night. And Batman runs into the darkness as a fugitive, blamed for murders committed by a dead man, carrying a guilt that belongs to someone else, having chosen the lie because the truth felt too expensive. Gordon watches him go. Then he turns to his son and explains that Batman is the hero Gotham needs rather than the one it deserves. A dark night. It is a beautiful speech. It is also, within the logic of the film, a lie told to a child about why a good man is being hunted. This is where the film plants its flag. Not in the Joker's chaos speeches. Not in the sonar machine. In the quiet moment after the crisis, when the people who survived it decide what story to tell about what happened, and choose the story over the truth, because the story is more useful. The warning the film carries is not about the Joker. Villains like the Joker, people who want to watch everything burn, who have no outcome they are protecting and no goal beyond proving a point, are rare. They are dramatic and they are dangerous, and they make for compelling cinema. They are not the primary danger the film identifies. The primary danger is the response to the Joker, the surveillance system Batman builds, the lie Gordon tells, the law passed in a dead man's name, the 8 years of peace that follow, built on a foundation that was never examined, because examining it would have required admitting what it was made of. Every real-world case examined in this essay followed the same sequence: a genuine threat, a genuine response. Tools built for the emergency that outlasted it. Foundations laid in the dark that held the structure up long enough for people to stop asking what they were made of. And then, eventually, an exposure. A court ruling, a whistleblower, a journalist, a villain with a public address system that revealed the gap between the official story and the actual one. The Patriot Act was sold as a temporary emergency measure. Its mass surveillance provisions ran for over a decade before a court found them unlawful. The NSA's collection program operated in secret for 6 years before Snowden revealed it. Guantanamo held 780 people over 2 decades, convicted 7 of them, and called itself a necessary response to an extraordinary threat. Abu Ghraib was explained as the work of bad apples, while the Army's own investigation confirmed it was the work of a bad barrel. Cambridge Analytica harvested 87 million people's data without consent, used it to target their psychological vulnerabilities, and closed its offices 2 months after the story broke, while the people who ran it moved on to other work. In every case, the peace held for a while. The structure stood. The official story was the one most people lived inside, and the cost was paid quietly, by people who had no access to the room where the decision to tell the story was made. Batman pays the cost alone in the dark. The ordinary citizen whose phone was converted into a surveillance device without their knowledge pays a cost they were never told about. The person held for years in a detention facility without being charged pays a cost the official story said was necessary and proportionate. The voter, whose psychological vulnerabilities were mapped and targeted by a political data firm, pays a cost disguised as a Facebook post from a friend. The Joker's thesis, that order is maintained through hidden choices made by people who have decided they know best, is proven correct by the ending of the film. Batman and Gordon decide what Gotham can handle knowing. They substitute their judgment for the public's right to the truth. They become, in that final choice, exactly the schemers the Joker described. Good people, decent people, people whose intentions were genuinely protective. Schemers, nonetheless. The film does not present this as a condemnation of Batman or Gordon. It presents it as a tragedy. These are people who tried to do right and arrived through a series of individually defensible choices at a place where the defensible choices had collectively produced something they could not have chosen directly. The system shaped them. The emergency justified the first crossing. The first crossing made the second easier. And by the end of the night, the lie felt like the only remaining option. Hannah Arendt watched Adolf Eichmann explain himself in Jerusalem and found not a monster, but a bureaucrat who had stopped thinking. Stanley Milgram watched 65% of ordinary Americans press a button they believed was delivering lethal shocks, because a man in a lab coat said the experiment required it. Philip Zimbardo watched healthy young men become sadists in 6 days because they had been given a uniform and a role. The film watches Bruce Wayne become a fugitive and James Gordon become a man who tells a lie to his own son. And it places these outcomes not in the category of individual failure, but in the category of systemic logic. Given the structure, given the pressure, given the emergency and the tools built for it, and the choices made in the dark, this was always where it was going. The warning is not that chaos wins. The ferry proves chaos does not always win. The warning is about the response to chaos, about the tools the response builds and keeps, about the stories the response tells, about the 8 years of peace that follow and the bill that arrives when the story finally meets someone willing to tell a different one. Russ Feingold voted no when it was 98-1. Thomas Drake raised concerns through every proper channel until the channels ran out, and then talked to a journalist and spent years under the threat of prison. Edward Snowden copied documents and flew to Hong Kong and has not been home since. Christoph Miley picked up papers from a shredding bin and carried them out of a building and lost his country. The man on the ferry walked to the front of the boat and threw the detonator into the river and sat back down, and the night continued to be terrible. These people did not fix the systems they were pushing against. The Patriot Act passed. The surveillance ran. The shredding continued in other banks. The night was still dangerous. What they did was put something on the record. A vote, a document, a testimony, a detonator in the water instead of a burning ship. The record of what was said and done and refused, when it would have been enormously easier and safer to say nothing and do nothing and let the button press itself. The Dark Knight is a film about a man in a suit fighting a man in grease paint. It is also a film about the oldest and most persistent problem in the history of organized human society. The problem of what to do with power. Who holds it? Under what conditions? With what checks? Toward what ends? And what happens to the people and the places where those questions are answered badly, or in secret, or not at all? Batman destroys the sonar machine. In reality, the machine keeps running. The film knows this. The self-destruct is the fantasy. Lucius Fox typing his name and watching the screens go dark is what responsible power would look like, if responsible power were the rule rather than the exception. The film offers it as a wish rather than a prediction, a picture of what the right answer looks like, held up against a history that keeps choosing differently. The warning is not new. It has been issued before in different forms by philosophers and psychologists and senators and whistleblowers and people who picked up documents from a shredding bin on a night shift. The warning keeps being issued because the pattern keeps repeating. Emergency, tool, normalization, exposure. The next emergency, the next tool. The question the film leaves behind when the lights come up is the same question every version of this story leaves behind. Not whether the warning can be heard. The warning has been heard. Not whether the pattern can be identified. The pattern is visible to anyone who looks. The question is whether understanding the pattern is enough to change it. Whether watching a story about order's dangers produces anything in the person watching it beyond the recognition that the story is familiar. Whether the ferry moment, the detonator thrown into the river, the choice made against the system's momentum, is available to ordinary people in ordinary moments, not just to whistleblowers and outlier senators and men on boats with explosives strapped to them. The film believes it is. The ferry proves it is. The history suggests that it is rarer than the film hopes, and more possible than the history makes it seem. That gap between the rarity and the possibility is where the warning lives. And it is, for anyone paying attention, exactly where we have been living all along. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.